It Ends With Us is in theaters this weekend. This film stars Blake Lively, Brandon Sklenar, Justin Baldoni, who also directed the film. Rounding out the principal cast are Jenny Slate, Hassan Minaj, Alex Newstater, and Isabella Farah. It Ends With Us is an adaptation of the best-selling phenomenon of the same name, written by Colleen Hoover. I'll tell you, I have not read the book, and I think that's an advantage because I went in without any preconceived, omniscient position about how these characters should respond to the obstacles in front of them. I like that. I find that that's an advantage. Now, I did see the trailer. The trailer didn't really drive me to want to see it because it came off as woman savory, which is just not my jam. And I'm here to say that trailer doesn't do justice for the film. It's not that. It's not, he's a good man, Savannah. This film is not absent of any issues for me. Most of the issues I have are with the plot because there's so many holes. But the nucleus of the story, the heart of the story, is what I responded to. What is this movie about? At its core, this is a love triangle between a young woman who should choose her childhood sweetheart, who wants to protect her from the man she's actually with, this abusive neurosurgeon who just looks good on paper. Someone she promised herself she'd never be with after suffering through and experiencing abuse at the hands of her father. It's a lot more than that, of course, but that's the nucleus of the story. When I was watching this, and I saw this twice in the theater already, I felt like this was the origin story to Sleeping with the Enemy. Because if you've seen Sleeping with the Enemy, Julia Roberts is in an abusive relationship, and the abuse is the catalyst to the rest of the story. But we really don't get to understand why she's with him, what made her fall in love with him, since the signs were there. And in this story, we find that Lily Bloom, played by Blake Lively, ignored the signs. The signs were prominent that this neurosurgeon she falls in love with was abusive. And she ignored those signs, not intentionally, but because there is a part of her childhood that remained dormant and that was exercised, I find, as the relationship with this abuser got more prevalent in her life. He pulled out of her what she'd been running from for her entire life. Now, she moves to Boston because her childhood sweetheart, brilliantly played by Brandon Sklenar, told her that it's better in Boston. And she's been fleeing from her parents. Her father was abusive to her mother, and she resents her mother from staying in that abusive relationship. Her father is a mayor of this town in Maine. He ends up dying, and she has nothing good to say about him to eulogize him at his funeral. She has to grow in some capacity, and we go on this journey with her as she grows to understand the mistakes. And now, this neurosurgeon that she's with also suffered a traumatic event in his life. This story does not go out of its way to redeem him for being abusive despite his suffering a traumatic event in his childhood. Here's the thing, this is a PG-13 movie about domestic violence. I'm a rated R girl. I don't like my stories censored. My life is rated R, and so that's what I respond to. This is PG-13, and I understand why to appeal to a broader audience, particularly the fans of this best-selling phenomenon, this novel. I get that. But it's domestic violence, and it came off as maybe a Lifetime movie. It was just a little too censored for my taste in that respect. Although I like this movie, I like what it does. It's good where it's good. And even the issues I have with the film do not diminish the parts of it that I did like and respond to. I wish it were rated R, but I understand why it wasn't. And when I say PG-13, it is edited down to where you don't even see any of the punches land. You don't see the abuse. And there is essay in this movie too, at least twice. You don't see it. They show you just enough where you won't be too triggered by what you see on screen. I get that. Again, this is PG-13. You don't want to go too far. The editing was sophomoric. It cuts bluntly to make sure you get the idea of abuse, but you really don't see it. It's like really blunt editing, blunt cuts, which to me just seemed sophomoric, right? But also, if I could use another reference, what's love got to do with it? Does the same thing, believe it or not. Now, that was also an adaptation of a best-selling memoir, Tina Turner's memoir. And Tina Turner and Ike Turner were still alive when this biopic was released in the 90s. So you can understand why Lawrence Fishburne, who played Ike Turner, demanded that you don't see all of the punches land, the physical abuse, and the essay scene, that you don't see it. I get that because your imagination can finish the scene for you, and that was a liberty that makes sense looking back on it. There are scenes in this film that are triggering enough where you don't have to see it. I just would have preferred a little, I would have preferred the editing to be better. And as I watched it, I also wondered if this would have been better in the hands of a woman. Now, I think Justin Baldoni does a good enough job, sure. He stars in it and he directed, so he had double duty. But I kept wondering if this would have been better in the hands of maybe the writer Christy Hall, or maybe even Jenny Slate, or Blake Lively. What would Blake's interpretation of this story be? I yearned for another interpretation. I thought maybe if Blake had directed and starred in it, we might have gotten something a little deeper because it seemed surface level for most of the movie. Now, where the film really felt elevated and I was motivated by the story were the flashback scenes with Isabella Farah and Alex Newstater, because that was the heart of it all. They are experiencing abuse in real time. I thought maybe this material would have been better as a series to expound on the childhood and then journey into adulthood, because so much is missing. Not to get all 40 in, but survivors of abuse tend to pattern relationships from what they experienced, the environment that they were in their childhood. And I would have liked to see what her relationships look like post Atlas. I would have liked to see some semblance of that. I know there's not a whole lot of time to put everything in this film, but I would have liked to see something more, a little more layered with the story, her build up to the point where she's willing to overlook the signs and accept, fall in love with, partner with this man who is abusive. I wonder what those relationships look like too, because when you do survive abuse, it pops up in your relationships or remains dormant as you stay busy with other things, overcompensating for what you survived as a survivor or victim of domestic abuse. We don't get to see that in this film, but it might have been possible if it were a series. And so there were times I yearned for more, and I yearned for more of the story in the childhood, the flashback scenes. There are some really touching scenes here. Blake has to look in the mirror at the reflection staring back at her. And if you have suffered abuse, then you've had to look at this mirror too. If you haven't, you will. And I love how Blake delivers this scene. She uses her face a lot in this performance. And there are a couple of scenes where she stares at the reflection. She finds herself in this moment ashamed at the reflection. Jenny Slate plays Lily's best friend, and the arc of her character was underdeveloped. I think she does a good job to lighten the mood because, in many ways, she is the comic relief in what is otherwise a really dark premise. But I think she should have been the conscience of this story. Now, she has a scene, a tearjerker, in the third act, but it seemed a little late in the story to get there, this arc. I think her character was underdeveloped, written underdeveloped. Because in these movies, we need a conscience. And I feel like Lily didn't have that. She had to come into it on her own, looking into this reflection or staring at this reflection in the mirror and coming to it herself, because no one else in her life in this story played the conscience. Now, you might say, well, what about Atlas? But Atlas isn't in the scenes enough to contribute to her arc. So she has to come to it herself. And I felt like that didn't help the story, that she had to come into it herself. She had Atlas and she has the baby, but she's got to do this on her own. And I felt like she was alone in that journey, and I probably would have written it differently. Listen, the outfits each in this movie, the outfits were so good, particularly Lily's outfits, because they carried the story and the messaging of the movie too. Lily is a florist in the film and grew up in her childhood. She loved flowers and had an oak tree in her backyard that meant something to her. She connected with Atlas and this oak tree, and even has a tattoo and a memento that Atlas made for her from this oak tree. She pairs gauche and grunge with luxe. And I feel like what she's draped in just contributes to the story and how she shows up and how she presents herself. I loved the story that the clothes, the wardrobe told in this movie. All in all, I like the movie. I think what I don't like about it pales in comparison to what I do like. The performances are outstanding. Isabella Farah, this is her first feature film. She did spectacular. She had Blake Lively's mannerisms and the tone of her voice, and I think she did fantastic. I'm looking forward to what she does next. I liked this movie. I highly recommend that you see it this weekend in the theater. It Ends With Us is in theaters now.